Harris.
Okay, well, good morning everyone. So I'm going to talk about firstly arboriculture's role in wildlife conservation, and then I'm going to give a case study about target species conservation and what Shane was talking about, the Major Mitch's Cockatoo project that we worked on in Wyperfeld National Park. So I'll just give you I'm going to walk around a little bit. If that's distracting, I'm sorry, but I'm feeling a little bit nervous, so I'm going to take the nerves out by walking around. So just to give you some background about myself, so you know where I'm coming from and where I'm getting my viewpoint. So I've been an arborist for over 12 years. Started off as ground crew climber, and then got into consulting and training. And I've been very fortunate to have worked with canopy scientists and ecologists, using my climbing skills to help their projects. And working with these people inspired me to study. So last year I finished a degree in environmental science with a minor in wildlife conservation. So I'm trying to really bring you a combination of perspectives and trying to apply it to what we do. So the reason we're here really is to talk about our hollow dependent fauna. So I know that James is going to talk about this more, so I'll just go over this briefly. But in Australia, we have over 300 species of hollow-dependent fauna. And when I say dependent, the hollows are a critical ecological resource for those species. So that means without them, they're not going to be able to shelter, roost, or nest. So essentially, they cannot persist without those hollows. In Victoria, we've got 16 species of mammals and 44 birds that require hollows. A couple of pictures here of two critically endangered Victorian species. The lead-bearded possum and the orange-bellied parrot are both hollow users. And the loss of hollows from our native woodlands and forests has been identified as a key threatening process. So we've already got a very high extinction rate in Australia, and we don't want it to get any higher. And primarily that's been the smaller land mammals who've been heavily impacted by feral foxes and cats. And to a certain extent, arboreal species have been isolated from this threat because they're in the trees. They're able to escape from the foxes and cats. When the canopy of the forest becomes scattered and they need to use the ground to move between trees, then they will also be exposed to predation. And I think James is going to talk more about connectivity in the landscape. So what can arborists do? Why should we be involved, and what responsibilities do we have? Well, in the urban and semi-urban or peri-urban environments, we're the primary tree managers, which means we are the people responsible for managing trees with hollows in, which means we also have a responsibility for managing hollow-dependent fauna. We have unique skills, so I'm going to talk about how we can apply our skills to wildlife conservation, and we're also enthusiastic, and this is a picture of one of the most enthusiastic arborists I know, climbing a big mountain ash tree. What are the benefits of us, to us as arborists of being more involved with wildlife conservation? Well, it's going to improve our ability to assess the habitat value of trees. We're very good at assessing trees, and we assess them for different values, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, but it's going to improve our ability to assess the tree's habitat value. It's going to allow us to have a better idea of the trees actually occupied before we undertake works on it, particularly tree removal works. And it's going to increase the effectiveness of our habitat creation works. So just to give you an idea of what I was talking about when I said urban and rural, this is an urban to rural gradient. This is Melbourne here, and this is the urban area. So you see the black is impervious surfaces like roads, buildings. As we come into what I'm going to call the semi-urban, this is where we'll have patches of remnant trees. I think Tim is going to talk about tree management in Whittlesea. And this is where we can do some quite important work. And this is the forests and woodland areas where arborists are probably not going to be the primary tree managers. It's going to be people like Vic Forests or Deppy or Vic Parks. And again, just to differentiate what I'm talking about, I'm going to be talking about target species conservation. So that's particular species that are threatened or endangered, and most of that work is going to be taking part in the bushland and woodlands rather than in the urban areas. But there's still great value to creating habitat in urban areas, and I think again James is going to talk about the benefits of urban habitat. Okay, so our skills as arborists were very good at tree surveying, so collecting baseline data on tree locations, species, size, dimensions, all of that is critical information when we're managing hollow-dependent fauna. That's a photograph from a project I worked on in southeast Sulawesi, where we're looking at arboreal herpetofauna, so that's reptiles and amphibians, and we're comparing them to the stuff we found on the ground. Scientists are trying to smile for the camera, but they're completely stuffed, exhausted, trying to climb this tree in the tropics. But we're very good at surveying trees, and we shouldn't undervalue the contribution of that to wildlife conservation. We're also very good at assessing trees. So we assess trees for multiple values. We health assessments, structure assessments, amenity value, and particularly risk assessment is what I'd like to talk about now. Now, why am I going to talk about risk assessment when we're a habitat creation workshop? Well, a lot of the features of trees, which are ecological resources such as hollows, cavities, cracks, splits, large sections of deadwood, are ecological resources, but they're also the features we're identifying when we're risk assessing a tree that may indicate the tree is structurally compromised. So we've got to negotiate between managing trees for risk and managing them for their ecological value. And how do we do that? I'm just going to have a look at my watch because I feel like I'm talking very fast and I want to get the timing right. So we're going to manage trees for multiple values. This is taken from the Australian standard for the protection trees on development sites, which identifies 4 different categories of values that trees have. And I think Anna's going to talk about the heritage values. But what I'd like to talk about for a moment is how do we negotiate managing trees for risk and managing them for their ecological values. So just to give you an idea there. So there's a couple of tree assessment methods that deal with this. And I'm particularly talking about injured, declining or dead trees. These are the ones which have those features or defects depending on the lens we're looking at when we're assessing them. And the first one is tree A to Z, which is Jeremy Barrell. And for those not familiar with this method, it's essentially a pre-construction retainability matrix. And you categorize the trees as either A class, so they have a high retention value, or a Z class tree, where they have a low retention value. And he identifies a A4 class, which is a tree which may have very poor health, very poor structure, but also has potentially a high ecological value as habitat. And now we don't have to be expert ecologists because we've got enough on our plates with managing trees, but we do need to be able to identify when an ecological assessment may need to be undertaken for a tree. And again, with QTRA, Quantified Tree Risk Assessment, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with that. Ellison there identifies that in a declining tree, there may be a reduction in the amenity value, in the fact that it's dying, so the visual value of the tree is reduced, but there's deadwood, which is providing a habitat. So what I'm trying to get to is how do we manage trees for multiple benefits, and particularly how are we going with managing trees for risk and managing them for their ecological values? Well, we're not going very well, actually. This is some modelling from the Fenner School of Environment in Canberra, and they were looking at the number of tree hollows. So this is a modelling they've done of urban green space. And they're large hollow-bearing trees. In the worst-case scenario, it's going to be about 115 years before they're all gone from around Canberra. And that's because at the moment, the majority of them are being managed for risk, and the risk management entails removing those trees. So this is the urban green space, this is their modelling. These are the limits, the confidence limits. In the worst case scenario, 115 years, large hollow-bearing trees are going to be gone from the urban green space. At the end of this paper, they identified 3 processes which can reverse this trend. And this is really what I've been building to, and this is what we need to be getting into as arborists, because they are all areas which fall under our responsibility. Maximise the standing life of trees. Well, we're very good at that. We can increase the ULE of trees through plant health works, such as Matt was just talking about, through risk reduction works and pruning management works. Increased tree regeneration rates. Arborists again have responsibility for planting new trees in urban environments, so that falls to us again. And accelerate the formation of habitat structures provided by large old trees, and this is really what we're here today to talk about, is how do we construct habitat. So that's really our role. Back to our skills, our unique skills. Climbing is an extremely useful skill in ecological research, but also wildlife conservation. This is a project I've been involved with for a number of years, which is the Victorian Peregrine project. I'm trying to extract a chick from this nest. There's actually a disused wedge-tailed eagle's nest that the peregrines have taken over. And we're banding the chicks, and then we can follow the lifetime success of these birds, and we can monitor any decline. So a conservation project that directly relies on the skill of climbers. So we have unique skills and we can apply them to arboriculture. We can apply the arboriculture skills to wildlife conservation. Installing nest boxes, being able to climb high into the canopy to choose the optimum position rather than relying on ladders is very important. And I think James again is going to talk about aspect of installing hollows and boxes. Camera traps are increasingly becoming important as ecological monitoring tools, and again, climbers can get them in the trees in the optimum positions. So we have got good skills. We've got very high-level chainsaw skills. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know that Pat's going to cover this in his presentation. But certainly, to maximise the standing life of trees, we may need to undertake some canopy management. We can remove deadwood. We don't necessarily have to remove all the deadwood. We can leave some deadwood. Weight reduction pruning or retrenchment pruning are all things that require us as arborists with our particular skills to maximise the standing life of trees. So we're managing the trees to reduce the risk, but we're also trying to retain them to continue having an ecological resource in the urban green spaces. And we can accelerate the formation of habitat structures by creating hollows, and I'll talk more about the coronet cuts in a moment. So just an introduction, and really the critical point is I'm getting across is we have a lot to contribute, and we also have responsibility. As the tree managers, we have the responsibility for managing these ecological resources. So now I feel like I'm racing. I'm not really timing it very well. Okay, Major Mitchell's Cockatoo. So this is a project I worked on. They started out as DEPI and then they changed to whatever. So Major Mitchell's Cockatoo is an endangered parrot, Victorian parrot. They are obligate hollow users, so they require hollows to breed and for shelter, and they're secondary hollow occupiers. Which means they don't excavate their own hollows. They take over or enlarge existing hollows. They're quite particular in their choice of hollow. They have quite specific dimensions that they require, and they also prefer slender calitris pine, Calitris pressii, and it's thought that they prefer calitris not only is it one of the most abundant trees in the environment in which they live, but the essential oils, it's quite, I don't know if any of you have worked with calitris, quite pungent, scented wood, and it's thought to have insecticidal qualities, and so may reduce the parasite loading on the birds, so they do have a definite preference. So we were called in to as an emergency response, so just before I talk about that, just to give you a bit of context, this is from the Australian Bird Atlas, the sightings of Major Mitchell's cockatoos. This is Wyperfeld National Park up in the Mallee near Mildura, and this section here is Pine Plains, which is sort of one of the strongholds of the birds, which is under management. So a lot of these other areas are farmlands where it's much more difficult to do conservation work. So this area here is critically important for the bird. So we got called in after the January 2000 and that should actually say 2014 fire, sorry, my mistake, because a large section of their existing hollows had been burnt. And just to give you some context of the site, so this is the fire scar. So it was an extensive fire, it varied in intensity. In some sections, everything was burnt to ash. In some sections, trees were killed, but mainly by the radiant heat. So the foliage was dead, but the structure of the tree was still intact. And that's why they called us in, to see if we could create some hollows. You have a hollow deficit there, an existing hollow deficit before the fire, and that's because in the 40s it was logged, because the timber has good termite resisting qualities, so a lot of it was taken out. You've had very poor regeneration of young trees because of herbivory from feral rabbits, goats, and also kangaroos, so poor regeneration. So what you've got left with are remnant patches of large old trees. And the trees need to reach an age of around 120 years to be of a suitable size to bear a hollow for a major Mitchell's cockatoo. Sorry, I should have just mentioned they're quite a large cockatoo, around the same size as a galah. So you've got patches of remnant old trees, very poor regeneration, not many semi-mature trees coming up in the younger cohorts to replace them. So the trees they had left were a critical resource. The fire came through, knocked out a lot of those trees. And now they've been monitoring these birds for over 20 years. They had very good data about where they were nesting and what trees were important, and a lot of them were knocked out. So there was a real emphasis to do something quickly and get some good results for replacement hollows. Egg theft at Wyperfeld Park has historically been a big issue. So people poaching eggs for the illegal bird trade, and competition with galahs. So galahs are super abundant because they're able to feed off the grains, the grain wastes, the seconds of the grain. So anyone who's been up around Mildura and the Mallee will have seen huge flocks of galahs. And they're a very similar sized birds to the major Mitchells in the same environment, so they're competing for the same hollows. So that's the background. So first of all, we were asked to go in and have a look and see if we can identify some trees that would be suitable for installing artificial hollows. And I've just put this picture in to give you an idea. So in some sections everything was gone, in some sections the fire had been through and killed the trees, but they had remained standing. And you see there's been a bit of rain after the fire, it started to green up a bit. So this is the sort of things we're working on. And we used a variety of techniques. And before I talk about those, this is just an example of what I was talking about with poor regeneration. So this tree has had its apical stem damaged by a herbivore early in its life, and it regenerated in this multi-stem form. And the problem with this is that none of these stems are going to reach a size to bear a hollow for a major Mitchell's cockatoo. They're not going to reach a sufficient diameter. And also, you can see the bark inclusion at the bottom. They're starting to fall to bits. So there's a big issue because there's not many younger trees coming up to replace the old ones. I think James is going to be talking again about more the long-term management of tree hollows, but I'm just talking really about a short-term emergency response. So this is some of the data from the long-term monitoring, and this trend line is looking at the loss of tree hollows, so of known tree nests, and this is the trend line from the natural attrition over the years. So this is either the trees collapsing due to decay or wind, and you can see before the fire, so this is the number of hollows left after the fire. Before the fire, they're still in a pretty dire situation. Around 2024, they're predicting there will be no hollows left in Pine Plains for the major Mitchell's cockatoos. But the fire is a significant jump down. So that's why we're called in for the emergency response. Because they had very good data on they'd measured the existing natural hollows over a series of years. They had very good data on the dimensions, which is quite rare and quite special to have that information. So when we were doing our works, we were required to mimic as closely as we possibly could the known natural dimensions. And these are the dimensions we're looking at. And the critical one there was, they believe the critical one there was the wall thickness, which has a lot of implications for the insulating value of the hollows, and also the diameter of the floor, the area of the floor, because that determines how many chicks they can raise. So if they've got a suitable size one, they can maybe get up to 3 chicks out. the smaller it is, the less chicks are going to succeed. So that was one of our specifications. We used a variety of methods, and these have different applications at different life stages of trees. We didn't actually, so initiate, to describe initiate is where you're basically going to wound a semi-mature, early mature tree. So something like a flush cut or a rip out of a branch, which opens up the heartwood and accelerates the natural process of hollow formation. But that is an extremely long process and can take decades, if not centuries in some trees. So that wasn't really suitable for what we were looking for. We're looking to increase the number of hollows in the short term. Excavation, this was done on dead trees and is essentially using Pat's technique, and so I'm not going to talk much about that because I'm going to leave that to Pat. So we're doing that on dead trees, though we did do a couple in stags or snags of live trees which were dead above. Augmentation was something that we tried. I believe we might be the first people who've tried this, where there were living trees which had existing hollows in or decay, but too small to be used by Major Mitchell's cockatoos, so we excavated them out and increased the size of those hollows in living trees. We also did some restoration works. So that's trees which, it says here stasis. I argue to put senescent, but senescent is probably a term you're more familiar with. So these are trees that are really over mature, in advanced state of decline, most likely have poor structure, and have had existing hollows which have been used by Major Mitchell cockatoos, but for a variety of reasons are no longer suitable. So maybe the bottom has dropped out due to decay, or the top has snapped off, so it's open to the elements, or the face of the hollow is broken off. So we're doing a bit of a sort of a mix of different techniques to renovate these trees. And we also created some nest boxes, which we used the dimensions I mentioned before to try and mimic as closely as we could the natural hollows. And we used salvaged timber from Wyperfeld National Park, so salvaged dead Clytrid's pine. So this is excavation. I'm going to just skip by this because Pat's going to talk about this in detail. Augmentation, so we basically identified trees that had existing hollows and decay, and we'd excavate out the decay, and then we'd excavate further using angle grinder with chainsaw teeth. The danger of this is we'd damage the sapwood and kill the tree, but we're trying to be careful not to do that, though we're not really sure until it expresses in the health of the tree how we've gone with that. But that potentially has a lot of benefits because that hollow is in a living tree, so the longevity of that hollow is likely to be greater if the tree doesn't decline than putting hollows in dead standing trees. Restoration, we used a variety of techniques. So very simple, putting a top back in, filling it up with chip, like coarse chip to raise the level. So Major Mitchells prefer a depth of around 60 centimetres. When it gets much deeper than that, the chicks find it hard to get out, and the parents are much less likely to use it. So we're trying to get the level right for them. Filling in cracks and splits in the side of the trunk, and also we've put a new face plate on here. So that's the restoration works we did. We also created some nest boxes. So there's other standing trees that weren't suitable. So Casuarina crista, there's a lot of those around. They're not suitable for Major Mitchells, but they are in the environment, in the nesting area. So we put nest boxes up in there. We also did coronet cuts on the tops of the dead standing trees. So if you're not familiar with coronet cuts, basically it's just a jaggedy top. We did that for 3 reasons. We reduced the weight, firstly to try and increase the structural stability of the standing dead trees, so hopefully they're going to be in the landscape for longer. We wanted to try and disguise them as much as we could from potential egg thieves, so I'm talking about humans there, because if you have a flat profile of a straight cut, it's going to stand out much more than a jagged profile, and hopefully when that ages up, it'll be much more difficult to pick. And there's also ecological benefits to having a jagged top which simulates a natural fracture. So it makes it easier for invertebrates to colonise. So this is what we got to. So we created some hollows, and the red line is the new trend line following the expected rate of attrition in hollow-bearing trees. So we've pushed it out a little bit. We've given them a little bit longer, getting to around 2036 there. So that's a predictor of success. We've increased the potential use of pine planes for this species. We did all right in mimicking the dimensions. So these are box whisker plots. I'm not going to talk too much about those, but the critical information is that this black line here is the average value. So with the cavity, the DBH of the trees which we put the cavities in, you can see that the natural cavities, the DBH is much greater. It's around 70. But on our trees it's much lower, and this just simply reflects the fact that there were no really big old trees left to work with. We're really working with early mature trees. And again, with the height above ground, the natural cavities, they're around 8 metres. The ones we put in are a bit lower, around, probably most of them are around 5 or 6 metres. And that's, again, because we were limited, because we couldn't go much higher because the trees were getting too thin because they weren't as big and weren't as old. How do we go with use by Major Mitchell's cockatoos? Well, in the natural cavities, Major Mitchell's cockatoos are using most of them. You can see the gallards getting in there, and there's a few other bird species that are using them. So SNC stands for Simulated Natural Cavity, which was the compromise that we came to. Which basically means an artificial hollow or a man-made hollow or whatever you want to call it. So simulated natural cavity, and you can see the gallards that I've got in there, and that's because there's a shitload of gallards and they're pretty good competitors for Major Mitchell's. Major Mitchell's were using some of them, and that's a mixed success and failure. In a way it is a success because it shows that the works we did are suitable for a cockatoo of that size. And will be occupied by them, so be it a galar or a Major Mitchell's. It also shows that for target species conservation there's other factors, and that the hollow abundance does not necessarily translate into hollow availability for the target species. So these are some of the advantages and disadvantages of the techniques. So for excavation, that's an extremely efficient technique, and one we probably enjoy doing most because it was probably the best use of our time, I think, per dollar, like to produce those. That was excellent. Generally they're restricted to dead trees, which is fine. Augmentation was something that we were trying, which was talking about enlarging existing hollows and live trees. And we have high hopes that could be quite an effective technique, but it's very, very time consuming. Restoration, again, was quite easy to undertake, but a lot of the trees that we're restoring are in very poor structural condition, and I would say around 50% of them you wouldn't want to climb, so EWP may be required for those, which depending on where you are can be a major issue, because we're working in the Mallee, so large sand dunes, and often not able to access with EWP. Initiation is it's got great potential, but that's more for a long-term management of the tree population. And the Nestboxes we did quite well with mimicking the dimensions. It's probably because it's easier doing it in the workshop than actually when you're up the tree. We've got some good press, so it's always good to have a good news story. So we got a bit of press in Saturday's Age about aromatherapy for Major Mitchell's cockatoos, but it's good to get some of this information to the public. And just to conclude, so hollow abundance is critically important for target species conservation, and arborists can play a really key role there. We've got the skills to do that, but for target species there's multiple factors for success. So in the case of the Major Mitchell's cockatoo, managing the galars is going to be a major issue, otherwise it doesn't matter how many hollows there are, there's more galars than hollows that we can possibly make. getting the target species to occupy the hollow is not necessarily the same as them being able to breed successfully, which is the end result, because we want the population to increase. So we need to monitor the work we've done to ensure that the hollows we're creating, not only are they providing the right habitat for the adults, but it's also allowing the young to develop and mature. So in summary, we've got unique skills that we can apply, very valuable skills that we can apply to conservation works. We are in the urban and semi-urban environments, we are the primary tree managers, which means that we have the responsibility for managing trees for their ecological value. We've got a lot of enthusiasm, which is evidenced by you all being here today. We can improve our ability to assess the habitat value of trees by being involved with wildlife conservation, and just also say thank you to Ewan, who unfortunately can't be here today, who put a lot of hard work in on this project. I'm happy to send copies of the papers that we produced with DEPI to anyone who's interested.
They'll be made available online.
Yeah, brilliant.
Through the resources, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that later on. But ready for questions?
I am, yeah.
Any quick questions? We've only got a couple of minutes. Mr. Kearney.
The initiation stuff, was that all in trunk, or did you do some on secondary lateral branches?
Sorry, I didn't really explain that well. We didn't do initiation because we were just focused on like the short term, increasing the number of hollows available. But initiation, I think, and I think this is really important, I believe James is going to be talking about this more, is managing habitat over multiple time scales. So we're really focused on the immediate, like the next 20 to 30 years. But for successful conservation of major mixed cockatoos, we need to look at a time scale which is perhaps of a management plan that goes perhaps to at least 100, if not 200 years. So how do we encourage new trees? How do we protect those trees? And when do we start, initiating wounds on those trees to accelerate hollow development? So we didn't actually do any initiation.
Is there scope for licensing and training to do the target habitat creation, and who would implement that?
Well,
it seems like that sounds like that's an important factor, because it's not something that we could just go and do from our basic training.
Yeah, I think we were very lucky on this project because we had a lot of existing data on the dimensions of the hollows,
yep.
And that's quite rare. Often there's some information, but not a lot of information.
Yep.
And we had a very strong guidance from Victor at EPI. But I think that, the core thing is our basic arborist skills, so our climbing and chainsaw skills.
But shouldn't we know what, we should sort of know if we're working in a certain area, we're trying to create habitat for us, say, a particular species.
Yeah, okay.
We need to know what to do.
Yeah.
What should the dimensions of the hollows be? So that sounds like a bit of training and licensing to do. That sounds like it's important.
I think there's two things there. I think for target species conservation, I'll just go back to this slide right at the beginning. So for target species conservation, so where we're looking at endangered species, it's critically important that we get the dimensions right. When we're looking at introducing species into the urban environments, it's unlikely we're going to be drawing in threatened species because they're already absent from that environment. But there's multiple benefits to creating habitat. There's a lot of social benefits to having wildlife in cities. And then I think, having some understanding, and I think in the previous VTIO pruning workshop there was a table of different dimensions for different trees. I think Pat's probably going to talk about this more.
James actually made.
Okay, James.
So on the VTO website at the moment there's a reference page which has got a fair bit of stuff from James. Hopefully he's going to be adding to that. Well, I know he's going to be adding to that. I'm hoping. The VTO website's just increasing its resources.
Yeah, but yeah, in terms so actually answer your question instead of just waffling around it. I'm not sure if licensing is necessary. I think the more we know, the more knowledge we have, the more efficient we're going to be and more effective. But I think the licensing is really the arborist skills. So your training as an arborist is what you need to do.
Okay, probably got time for one quick question. If we've got one more, Mr. Nichols.
Feral bees up in that part of the world, are they a
Yeah,
general problem?
that's a really good question. So feral bees are a really bad problem for Regent's parrots, which are also up there, but they're generally by the river, by the creek sides, and they're particularly the bees are sort of limited by the availability of water, so they won't stray too far from water. But yes, certainly for Regent's parrots, which are also up in the Mallee, feral bees are a major issue. For the major Mitchells, because it's a bit drier, we didn't see any bees, which I was very pleased about, I must tell you.
Yeah, Mr. Waters, quickly, please.
On your graph about the use of the hollows, you had major Mitchells, Gallards and other. What sort of things are the other?
So there's, I think there was some owls, some babooks, I think, there were some kestrels. I can get that information for you, but yeah, a range of other birds.
So is that seen as a bit of a side benefit as well too?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. And look, we're really focused to show that this can work, and it was really a proof of concept because the number of hollows we actually created is actually quite, limited. It's a bit of a band-aid. You'd want to do much more extensive works to get a really good result, but yeah, anything that's using them, that's great, because major Mitchells are threatened at the moment, but if the loss of hollows continues in our native forests and woodlands, it's not going to just be major Mitchells, it's going to be a whole suite of species. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Grant Harris.